In my town, there's an old wives' tale of a boy who fell in love with a girl. He could never get up the nerve to ask her out. He'd follow her, waiting for an opportunity to approach her and ask her out. One day, he found out she was moving town due to problems with her parents and most likely never coming back. He decided he'd wait on the outskirts of town and surprise her. While he was waiting, his head filled with all the possibilities that this event could lead to. He began to get excited, keeping his wrists together and drumming his fingers together. He saw her car leaving town and headed down the only road out which he was waiting beside, hiding in the bushes. As this was a rural road, there were large bushes either side of the road and only one lane for cars to drive on. As the car drew nearer, his excitement overtook him, and he leaped onto the center of the road, shocking the girl and not leaving enough braking distance for her to stop. The car swerved and hit the boy, launching him through the air and landing on the rough terrain of the rural road. The girl jumped from the car and approached his twitching body. As the girl bends down to examine his injuries, she hears a faint gasp from his body. He utters a single sentence. "Love me?" he asks with a grin, as blood trickles from his deathly grin. "What?" she replies in her confused state after presuming he had died. "Do you love me?" he questions, a sickly monotone voice. Yeah, sure," she answers after a moment of silence. "You're lying," he yells louder than he should be able to, considering his current state. The girl apologizes and begins to back away in fear of his screaming. A look of terror spread across her face. With great difficulty, he attempts to stand. He groans, accompanied by the cracking of his bones. He falls to the ground and lets out a cry of pain. The girl approaches him again in pity, lifting his arm over her shoulder and helping him out to get to his feet. She walks him to her car and lays him in the back seat, and he loses consciousness. She climbs into the driver's seat and continues the way she was headed. As there is no hospital in her town, she wasn't eager on spending the night with her parents. The drive to the next town is along a dark and lonely road. Nothing but empty fields on either side of it. She hears him shifting about in the back seat. She speeds up, eager to get to a hospital, where she can drop him off and continue with the rest of her long journey. "Are you alright?" she asks, not even sure if he is awake, but eager to fill the silence with something. Keeping his eyes closed, he questions her again. "Love me?" he mutters, as if the words pain him more than his wounds. She stays silent, pretending not to hear him, and turns on the radio to fill the awkward void which the question had created. "Why don't you love me?" he questions, continuing his interrogation. She sneaks a glance in the rearview mirror and immediately wishes she hadn't. The boy was now sitting up in the back seat, staring maniacally at the back of her head, an unsettling lifeless in his empty eyes. "You should lay down, rest. Your wounds could get worse," she suggests, hoping he'd stop his incessant glare burning deep into the back of her head. "Tell me you love me," he demands, raising his voice slightly louder than before. Lie down. We'll be at the hospital soon. I think I see streetlights ahead, she replies, again avoiding his question. Why won't you say you love me? He screams piercingly, causing the girl to jump in her seat. Stop this, she yells in response, trying to break through his screams of insanity. Love me! He screams one last time, wrapping his hands around her face. She yells out in agony as he claws at her upper face, gouging out her right eye. She screams continuously, the car swerving on the road as she grips her around the neck. Her focus is torn from her driving. Now being driven by her primal instinct to survive, the car swerves out of control and crashes into a telephone pole. The following morning, the car was discovered by local police officers, and the woman's body was examined by forensic experts who concluded that the woman didn't die from the crash, but from strangulation, as proven by the swerve bruising around her neck in the clear form of someone's hands. This is the part that confused the experts, as there was only one body discovered in the wreckage. Whoever else would have been in the car with her should have died from the crash itself. The boy hadn't been seen since that night. Some say he has returned to the town and has fallen in love again. There was once a guy living in our neighborhood named Jimmy. He got picked on a lot for being a confident and funny guy. His mouth tended to get him into a lot of trouble, and he seldom learned his lesson. He was just very content with who he was and refused to change it. When people asked him why they let him wail on him for his blunt comedy and wisecracks, he'd smirk and say, honesty is the best policy. At least they're not hiding anything from me, and I never am from them. One of the kids he inadvertently pissed off with a rather crude MILF joke was something of a psychopath with a sadistic streak who didn't take kindly to the insult. So he rounded up the other guys who didn't like Jimmy, and they cornered him after school in the science room. Your mouth got you into this. I want you to remember that, Brett, the ringleader, told him as he looked into Jimmy's terrified eyes. They grabbed some formic acid stored in the lab and threw it in his face. They stood around watching him scream in agony as it ate through his flesh before sniggering and running out, pretending to be concerned and wanting for help. When the paramedics arrived and were attending to Jimmy, who was no longer able to scream, the principal asked the boys if they knew what happened. Their leader, Brett, explained they were walking past. They saw Jimmy sulking around in the lab room. By the time they got in there, he was already in that state. The other members joined in and backed Brett up with other fake details as Jimmy tried to protest in silent agony. The principal nodded and told them he would speak to them after he had to work with Jimmy and gotten his side of the story after he was out of the hospital. A few days passed and Jimmy was kept in ICU with bandages on his face, the doctors salvaging what little they could of his face. His vision still intact in one eye, and his jaw withstanding despite the loss of flesh. He was still unable to speak and refused to respond to anyone. He just sat there, eyes unblinking and staring at the ceiling, bloodshot and filled with animosity. When he was discharged sometime later, He would not respond to anyone with anything other than the word liars. His social life gone. Unable to smirk or even crack a joke anymore. He scheduled himself in his room and began planning. Sick, vindictive thoughts started appearing in his mind. He would get them all one by one. Decimate them. Slice them. Burn them. He waited patiently until the group would be vulnerable. Late at night, when they said their goodbyes and went home separately, that's when he would strike. That weekend, Brett received a package in the mail, curiously opening it to find a VHS tape with the words "For You" etched crudely into the front. He put it in and played it. It was a crudely recorded home video by an unknown cameraman who didn't speak at all for the duration of the film. It began with the camera pointing at the date on a newspaper. It was yesterday. As he zoomed out, you could see it was in a basement, a single flickering light bulb. It was apparent this was no normal video. In front of the cameraman, on his hands and knees, was one of Brett's friends. He was naked, a dirty blindfold around his face and a crude gag in his mouth. He was covered in blood, horrific burns, lacerations, and wounds. One particularly large one on his back stood out that was almost looked like a word. The cameraman, with his gloved hands, took the gag out of the crying boy's mouth, and immediately he begged to go home. Please, let me go, man. I did what you wanted. Oh God. Jesse, Mike, Keith. You made me fucking butcher them. I just want to go home, man. Please. I'm sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. He just kept repeating it over and over, rocking back and forth as he did so. Brett's legs began to shake, and he felt the bile rise from his stomach. He could see the burned, mangled bodies in the background. The bodies of his friends. All of them have markings on their body in deep, large cuts. The cameraman reached out for the boy's chin and lifted it up, encouraging him to stand. He did so obediently. As he was slowly led to a door, off-screen, whimpering. Brett can see what's been cut into his friend's back now. It's the word liar. The camera cuts out temporarily. Then it restarts again. They're no longer inside. They instead out in the cold snow on the outskirts of the woods, and doesn't appear to be the original man holding the camera anymore. It's Brett's friend. He's whimpering and shivering as he holds the camera at one place for 30 seconds, pointing at some trees in the distance, hearing footsteps draw ever nearer. Where are you, man? You said I could go, man! You said I could go! The boy is screaming and crying, frightened out of his mind at the sound of crunching snow draws near from seemingly every angle. It stops. He turns around to see the mangled face of Jimmy. A horrifying howl blares through the speakers as the word liars appears before the tape abruptly stops. Brett feels faint and darts to lock the front door, knowing what was coming. As he turns to run for it, he immediately hits something and falls backwards. The last thing he ever hears is "Liars," as acid runs down his face and begins to slowly eat away at his flesh. The last thing he ever sees is Jimmy's face, contorting into a sick and twisted smile.
Oh, all the comrades that e'er I had, their sorrow